Do you really think 2 millimeters of nylon can protect you from the bloodthirsty creatures in the wilderness? This world is a strange one. As my own camping trip with friends is coming up fast, I figured it'd be a great idea to cover some more creepy camping stories, so we are going right back into the woods for more monsters, more haunts, more people that you should never turn your back to. Let me just say that no Bowie knife is big enough for the dangers that await you beyond the tree line. Here are 5 allegedly true camping scary stories. But first, as always, I want to let you all know which stories I'm looking for. Currently, I need fishing stories, real glitches in the Matrix, and I would love to do creepy stories from the United Kingdom. If you've got any of those, be sure to send them to us at darknessprevails.org. Thanks. Now, be ready for a long night. I'm sure none of us are going to be sleeping on this camping trip. Number 1. The Beast of the Canadian Woods. Submitted by Felix M. This story happened to my grandfather back when he was a teenager. He and his girlfriend, now my grandmother, had just had a nasty fight and broke up, which devastated him. His dad decided that sometime doing his favorite thing might cheer him up, and so they went camping. This had my grandfather up and about the second he heard about it, because camping has been and always will be one of his most passionate hobbies. My grandfather mentioned that when they were driving to the campsite, he had this unbreakable feeling that something was off. He later realized that once they drove past a certain point, he had stopped hearing any animals from the wilderness around him. No birds, no sight of the occasional moose, nothing. Fast forward to later when they were at the campsite. Now, it wasn't just him and his father there at the campsite. There was an Indian family that was camping not far from them, and they even shared a dinner with them and swapped stories. It was later that night when everything started to happen. My grandfather woke up inside the tent they had set up with the urge to, make a pit stop. So he quickly unzipped the tent and dashed into the woods, flashlight in hand. He made his way a while from the campsite as to not stink up the air, and he did his business. Now, as he started walking back, he realized that he must have gone a lot further than he thought, because it was taking a good amount of time to get back to the actual campsite. And it was at that same time that he felt he was being watched. So he picked up the pace a little, and he began to feel the full weight of the situation. He was in the middle of nowhere, not even sure if he was walking the right direction, and he felt like something was following him, closely. He says he started to feel like he was on the verge of tears. He was that terrified. It was then that he heard a branch snap on a tree behind him, causing him to whirl around to see nothing on the ground. But there was certainly something in the trees, something big with pale white skin, and it was incredibly lanky. He didn't remember why, but then he started crying, and he was laughing at the same time. Then the creature began to move toward him, which snapped him out of it and made him scream before he began to run at full pace back through the forest. He didn't dare look back at whatever it was that was chasing him, but he knew it was right behind him, and it was gaining on him at that. He then tripped and fell face first on a rock, immediately blacking out. He woke up with his dad and the Indian family's mother and son standing over him, while the dad looked for whatever had destroyed the trees above. It was sheer evidence that something had been there. All my grandfather said was, "We need to leave. That thing, it's not human." He tried to plead to his great-grandfather to believe him so that they would all leave. He said this so seriously that my great-grandfather knew that he must not have been lying. He wasn't that type of person. The next day, after some explaining, my grandfather learned that what he saw was probably a wendigo. Now, of course, the Indian family didn't stay long after explaining this, and neither did my family. My grandfather claims this story is 100% true, and I don't see what reason he'd have to make it all up, so I trust him. I completely believe that my grandfather encountered a monster in the Canadian woods. Number 2. Why are they following me? Submitted by Carflow. Now, I'm just gonna cut right into it. Ever since I could remember, I've been followed by these tall beings with black eyes and large heads. Whether you believe me or not, the fear I have is real. The first encounter I can remember was when I was camping in Mexico with my family to our usual camping spot. It's nothing too special. Late that same night, my cousin and I had to use the bathroom, which was pretty far from where we set up camp, so it was a long walk. As we were walking, I noticed that there were 2 tall, skinny figures up ahead, looking around. They seemed like they were searching for something. I still don't really know what, though. I pointed it out to my cousin, and he looked in their direction. We were both confused and a bit nervous, so we stopped walking, and then both of those things looked at us for a few seconds, and then they walked away. The rest of the trip we never saw anything unusual and had a good time, so we just blew off that sighting. I was only 8 at the time, so I didn't think back on it too much until after my next encounter. This event happened to me and my sister when I was 12, and it's by far the most terrifying for me. I was playing with my sister. I don't remember what we were doing, but we were having a good time of it. We were on the 2nd floor of the house, and the room we were in had a large window, which my sister was facing while I faced away. As my sister was laughing, all of a sudden her face went dead still, staring right behind me. She looked so serious and somber. This made me curious, so I turned around. I regret that choice to this day, because what I saw was this pale creature crouching down, staring through the window at us. It had completely black eyes and a head that seemed too big for its body. It seemed like it didn't have a mouth, with no visible nose. Its skin was gray, but almost seemed white. It was only there for about 5 seconds at most, and it moved out of view. My sister and I were petrified, so much so that we couldn't move. We could only sit there in silence and disbelief. When we could finally move, we went right up to our mom, and like any parent, she blew it off as a child's imagination. I wish she was right, but after that event, I began having these nightmares. Nightmares of being taken from my home and being put on a cold metal table. I would wake up with cuts on my body, cuts that I couldn't explain, and I even woke up with a gash on my back. Around the age of 14, all of this stopped, and I honestly thought it was over. I was wrong. The final encounter didn't happen to me, but to my aunt. I was 15 when this happened. I had spent the night at my cousin's house when we went to bed. When we finally did go to bed, it was really late, as we had stayed up playing video games. That night though, his dogs were barking non-stop and violently. But it wasn't too uncommon for them to do that. They were fairly aggressive for being small dogs, so we just stayed in bed. I went home the morning after, but that following night, the dogs began barking and snarling again, so my aunt went out to check on them. And she saw the same exact thing that I saw years ago, but it was crawling over her fence into her backyard. She simply watched the thing. It kept walking into the backyard until it finally saw her, and it stood motionless, as if wondering if it'd been caught. She told me it made a strange hissing noise at her, and then ran back to the fence and climbed up it in seconds. When my aunt told me this story of hers, chills went down my spine. Needless to say, my aunt didn't sleep that night. I'm turning 18 soon, and I sometimes feel like I'm being watched, or I'll hear something run away from my window at night. That alone is nightmare fuel for me. I don't know what they want from me, or why they follow me around, but I want it to stop. Luckily though, after I got my cat, everything seemed to slow down, and now I can't sleep unless my cat's in the room with me. Whatever those things are, I hope they'll leave me alone for good. Number 3. Hidden in the Brush. Submitted by Tyler. Around April or May of this year, 2016, my girlfriend and I went on a camping trip. Being from Michigan, places to camp are extremely plentiful, but who really wants to go to a campsite and deal with other people? So we decided the place for us to go would be the Manistee National Forest. It's a massive area of woodland hills. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Anyway, we were driving around the forest, and I pull into a small clearing off a dirt road. We scout around and decide to keep looking for other areas we can camp out at, keeping that area locked into our minds so we can stay there if we don't find a better spot. We drive maybe a mile away, and we turn down an overgrown trail. My car was barely high enough to not scrape along the ground. Mind you, I drive an '01 Ford Taurus. After driving about 200 yards in, we see a little clearing and decide that's where we want to camp out. We set everything up, gather firewood, and go for a stroll through the woods. It was pretty awesome. About 50 yards away from that campsite, there's a nice-sized hole dug into a little ledge off of a trail. I was curious about it, and I wasn't sure what it was, but it was deep, maybe a fox den, I thought. We continued walking around without straying too far from the camp, just taking in the beauty of nature. As the sun starts to set, we head to camp, and I dig out a fire pit and start a fire. As we were sitting there talking and making some lunch, we hear a very loud truck down the original trail we veered off of. But we can hear it stop and idle at what sounds like the turnoff. We never saw it with the curve of the road, but I think they'd be able to see my car from there since I just parked off the path across from our campsite. Suddenly, the truck turns around and drives off quickly, and we continue with our day without incident. But at night, things got even stranger. We were all sleeping, but I woke up as the tent began to violently shake. I was tired, and I thought nothing of it since it had been windy that night. As I fell asleep, I was awoken with the urge to pee. I wake up my girlfriend and I let her know that I'm stepping outside. I grab my flashlight, more like a spotlight, and I head out. Almost instantly, that feeling of eyes on me was everywhere. I shone the light all around me, but I didn't see a thing, so I chalked it up to paranoia, being an avid horror fan after all. I do my business and I head back in, and that's when I hear it. It's a very guttural cooing, almost like an owl mixed with a dog. It was long and drawn out, and it happened several times, each time lasting for about 3 seconds each. I stood there listening, and I realized that it sounded like it was right behind our tent. I grabbed my knife, and I woke up my girlfriend. Almost right away, she could hear it as well. In her sleepy haze, she chalked it up as an owl, but I'm from the backwoods, and I know just about every animal sound that would be in Michigan. This was no owl. In fact, it was like nothing I've ever heard. After a couple of minutes, it started to fade away. I didn't hear any footsteps or anything like that, but even still, the sound faded farther and farther away. No footsteps or anything like that, just the sounds getting quieter. I do need to add that behind our tent, where the sound was coming from, was tall grass just under knee height. So there wasn't anything sitting in a tree, and when I looked around with the flashlight, there wasn't even any eye shine. But it sounded way too big to be smaller than the grass, which almost makes me think it was crouched behind the tent. But why? The next day, I talked to my girlfriend about it, but she didn't really remember much of it, so I tried to let it go. We all decided to have one more walk before we finally left. We were walking through the woods again, down this old trail, but it was deathly quiet, unnaturally silent. Thinking back, the whole time we were out there, it was too quiet. We walked deeper and deeper into the beautiful forest until the foliage around us began to die. I don't mean they started to suddenly fade, but the further we got, everything looked dead. Many of the trees looked like they had been torn in half. Both confused and terrified, we turned back shortly after emerging into those dead woods, and we headed out. If anyone knows what we might have seen, I would love to hear your story. Thank you for listening. Number 4. What was that? Submitted by Darth Exodus. Recently, some coworkers from Burger King and I went on a bit of a camping trip. This was in Kentucky, very close to the Tennessee border. There were several of us. That was me, my best friend Kevin, his girlfriend Lexi, and some of our other coworkers. There were 12 of us in total. We set up camp next to a creek, and on the other side of that creek was a nearly 90-degree cliff, and beyond that was a pay lake. We used our cars as tents. We were all joking around and smoking pot, to be honest, until we got tired and I went to bed. I woke up because I had to use the bathroom, and when I checked, it was 3 in the morning. I walked across the bridge that led to the pay lake, and I did my business. The scenery was beautiful, so I ended up standing there for a while, just soaking it all in. As I looked around, I saw what I thought was a person walking at the edge of the woods not too far away, so I watched them, partially hidden by the building near the pay lake. A couple of minutes later, I heard someone from my campsite screaming. The sound was so sudden and primal, it sent chills throughout my body. I ran back as fast as I possibly could. On the bridge between me and the camp was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. That was the last thing I ever expected to see. It was some sort of animal, almost human in shape. The thing was larger and taller than me standing up. I'm 6'3", but this creature must have been a few inches above me, and its body was so lean and muscular. It was beyond intimidating. It was covered in brown fur, had claws, and a snout kind of like a German shepherd's, and ears like one too. Its eyes were black, small, and beady. It stood there staring at me for what felt like hours, and just before it ran off into the woods, I swear to God the thing grinned at me. By some miracle, the thing never attacked. It did yelp and then run into the woods. Apparently, Kevin threw a very large rock at the thing's head and scored a direct hit. The two of us walked back to camp, shaking and terrified. I got in my truck and locked the doors. I didn't sleep a bit that night. I couldn't stop thinking about what that may have been, trying to match it to known creatures, but it was impossible. And another part of me couldn't stop thinking, what if it came back, and maybe we should all just leave? Instead of sleeping, I just sat there in the seat, watching the edge of the woods around the camp. I swear at one point, I saw the thing at the top of the cliff on the other side of the creek, its yellow glowing eyes locked on me. When morning came, I saw no trace of it. All of us gathered round, and we tried to make the best of it. Sean was the first to speak. He told me that him and Tia were awoken by the front of their car being pushed down by something. He said when they looked ahead, they saw that same creature just sitting and crouching on top of their hood. Eventually, it left Sean's car and seemingly walked off, and that was around the time they heard Maddie screaming. Maddie told me that she was in Eric's truck with him. Eric had the passenger window down just slightly, just enough for someone to fit their hand through. Apparently, Maddie was on her phone and saw something out of the corner of her eye. Curious, she shined her phone light on it and screamed as soon as she realized it was a hairy, clawed hand reaching through that window. She said the moment it screamed, the hand flinched away and she heard heavy footsteps leaving the camp. Her screaming just about scared the heck out of everyone, including Eric, and woke up the rest of the troop. And that's when I started running back and I encountered the thing on the bridge. Not too long after, when Kevin noticed that I wasn't in my truck, he came looking for me. And that's when he saw the thing standing before me on the bridge. He said he swore the creature looked like it was about to attack. He did the only thing he could think to do. He picked up a rock, the largest he could find, and he threw it at the animal. After our creepy discussion, we all went home. I still have nightmares of that thing being outside my window at night, especially because I don't live too far from where we camped out that night. I've heard that Sean has had trouble sleeping after seeing that thing, and that Maddie is still a nervous wreck after seeing it. As for me, I wish I knew what it was, and I try not to think about what would have happened to me if Kevin wasn't there to fend it off. Would I even be alive to tell this tale to you? And number 5, creepy man encounter while camping. Submitted by Joe W. Over this past summer, I was camping with a couple of longtime family friends. Let's just call them Bill and Lauren. Throughout the whole previous summer, Bill, Lauren, their kids, and I went camping at their campsite. With us was Lauren's twin sister, Ashley, and her husband Tom and their kids. We would usually stay there every weekend that it was still nice outside. But I'm going to tell you about the day I had this terrifying encounter. To start from the beginning of the day, we all arrived at the campsite about noon. We had some fun swimming in the pond that the campgrounds had, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching me from the distance beyond the tree lines. I ended up fighting with myself, trying not to think about it too much, because I was trying to enjoy myself swimming in the hot Ohio weather. If you live in Ohio or ever spent a full summer day in it, you'd understand how the weather patterns can be really stupid at times. Still though, it doesn't get as hot as it does in other states. Eventually, we all decided to get out of the water to get dried off. We were going to cook some meat on the grill before Game 7 of the Cavaliers vs. Warriors came on. I happened to look near the pathway that led to the camper that Bill, Lauren, and their kids were staying, and all I could see was a man just standing there, looking in our general direction. He soon noticed that I had spotted him, and he ran into the trees. I was initially freaked out about it, but as not to scare everyone else, I decided not to tell the rest of the folks. We ended up grilling some steak and a bunch of other stuff. Tom worked at a factory that does a lot with putting all the meats in the packages, so he ended up bringing a lot of stuff to cook. We got done eating at around 6:30 that night, so we had a good half hour before the game started. We all went over to Bill and Lauren's camper and started a bonfire. We just talked and discussed until the game came on. We listened to the game on Tom's phone because we didn't have a TV with cable there. We didn't really go to bed until after 11 because we all stayed up to see who won. But I stayed up a little bit later because I like being alone for a little bit before going to bed. So I just sat by the fire, watching it and messing with it. A while later, I put out the fire and headed towards bed. I was to sleep in a tent outside the camper because Bill and Lauren's camper was just one more person too small. Exhausted, I ended up falling asleep only a few seconds after I got into the tent. But something woke me up around 2 a.m. I thought I heard something, and I'm a very light sleeper. After a few moments, I realized that the fire was going again, and so I sent Lauren a text asking if she was outside. She responded no, and she thought I was still awake with the campfire going. Now, I only texted her because I saw someone standing near the fire. And not soon after, Lauren called 911 to get the cops to come over, and I didn't really know what to do, because I honestly didn't know if the person had a weapon or not. So I just tried to stay still and wait for the cops to show up. Unfortunately, whoever was out there started to come over near my tent. I was kind of like a sitting duck. I should have run away when I had the chance. For one, I think the person would have gotten to me before I did make a run for it, especially how long it takes to unzip. And the zipper itself is very loud. A few seconds later, the worst part happened. The man began to unzip my tent. Now fearing for my life and horrified, I kicked at them as hard as I could, holding on to the zipper right after. I could hear the person outside stumble down the hill near my tent. It might sound stupid, but I stayed in the tent, holding on to the zipper for dear life. In horror, I heard the man get up and run back to my tent, tugging at the zipper again. At this point, I was crying. I didn't know how long I could keep this up, or if he might draw a knife and just rip the tent open. But only a few very long seconds later, a car pulled up at the campground, and soon after, the man took off into the woods. I ended up telling the cops everything that had happened. To this day, I'm not sure what came of it. I think it was just some creepy homeless man that was living in those woods. I still try and figure out why he targeted me, considering all the people we were at camp with. So, very scary homeless man, I just hope that we never meet again. Camping can be fun. Every once in a while, it's good to get away from society, to remind ourselves what nature is really like. You know, The same cold, uncaring nature that sees mothers eating their children, animals murdering their mates, and creatures preying upon anything smaller, anything that can't outrun them, and that includes you. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And don't forget, send us your fishing stories, United Kingdom stories, or glitches in the Matrix at darknessprevails.org. Thanks.